Home is where the blank is. How would you answer this question? For Christmas, way back in 2017, my best friend Paulette got me a one-question-a-day journal. If you're unfamiliar with what this journal is, it is a journal that lasts for 5 years, and surprise, there is one question to answer every day. I just recently, last year, finished all 1,825 questions. On every May 29th, my journal would ask this question: home is where the blank is. And every May 29th, for 5 years, my answer was home is where the dog is. Though, thinking about that phrase now, home is where the dog is doesn't nearly capture all of my thoughts surrounding what home is. I moved from Maryland to Boston for college in September of 2021. Within the first few weeks of being in Boston, I felt an emptiness in me. One night, I tried to go to bed early, but ended up spending a while just staring at my wall, which was covered in some of my favorite photos. Right by my head, where I was looking, there was a picture of my dog cuddled up by my side, a picture of me and Paulette laughing on New Year's Eve, a picture of my favorite Maryland State Park in the fall, a picture of my family and I on vacation in California. As I was lying there and looking at these pictures that usually bring me an immense amount of joy, I was overcome with sadness, and I couldn't stop myself from crying. I realized that looking at these photos, that in moving to Boston, I had left behind the home that I knew and grew up with, the people, the places, the memories. Home still felt like where my dog was, where my parents were, where my best friend was. And they were all very, very far away. That feeling of home that I knew so well was now just a picture on a wall. And I didn't have anything close to that feeling in Boston. I fell asleep that night, heartbroken and unsure of how to foster that sense of belonging and home in such an unfamiliar place with no friends or family close by. Not feeling at home in Boston and not knowing exactly how to find a sense of home was quite stressful for me, especially because I am a perfectionist who likes to know all of the solutions to all of my problems all of the time. Empty feeling nights piled up, and the fear of not finding home in Boston took hold of me. This fear pushed me to find a solution and to find it fast. So I frantically started looking for relationships that would be familiar. I wanted friendships and relationships exactly like the ones that I grew up with in Maryland, and I wanted them as soon as possible. I tried to meet as many new people as possible in hopes that even just one of those connections would develop into the ones that I had to say goodbye to. So I joined a bunch of campus organizations. I tried to meet strangers in the ever-crowded dining hall, and I even looked for apps that are meant to foster platonic relationships, but were very much styled after dating apps. I was desperate, but nothing that I initially tried and no one that I initially met made me feel that belonging and that love that I needed. I was trying to grow in a place where I was no longer planted, and it wasn't working for me. I was devastated. It felt like nothing was working out and that I didn't truly have a home anymore. Even more difficult to deal with was the fact that I didn't know what to do about it. There was this double pain of the emptiness of being far from home and the frustration of a perfectionist who couldn't find the right solution fast enough. In the following weeks, though, I had a few conversations with some friends and family that changed how I thought about home. A partner I had in math class, who is now an incredibly close friend of mine, identifies as non-binary and told me that their family refuses to acknowledge and accept them as they want to be. They have to be a completely different person when they're around their family. So Boston has become more of a home for them than their home ever was, because they found a place where they can be themselves. Another one of my now very close friends loves their family so much, but was more than happy to leave the town that they grew up in, even if it meant not seeing their family as often. I also talked with my parents during a night where I was feeling particularly empty. My dad, who knows me painfully better than I do, mentioned how it seemed like maybe I was trying to recreate my Maryland life in Boston instead of enjoying the thrill of living somewhere new and being able to make a new home here. Before these conversations that I had, I thought family, hometown, familiarity was the definition of home. But in trying to find a home in Boston for my first time, I was learning that home could be so different and so much more than just those things. It was a bittersweet realization for me. I really didn't want to give up what I had in Maryland, but I knew that I had to take the risk of being okay with finding my new home in Boston. It was a gorgeous fall day, and I knew a walk along the Esplanade would do me and my mind some good. It was my first time walking along the Charles with nothing to worry about and nothing to think about for a long time. The further I walked along the path, the more things that I began to notice. I watched the red line cross the salt and pepper bridge every few minutes, hearing the creaks of the old subway cars even from where I was walking. I saw the lit up Prudential Tower on my right and the MIT Great Dome on my left. I saw the swans and ducks paddling around. I saw this mixture of nature and city that I totally forgot I was excited for when I first decided to move here. Most surprisingly, though, I ran into my partner from math class, who I mentioned earlier. They were also enjoying a weekend walk on the Esplanade, and we ended up walking back together. Instead of walking the same way back, though, we ventured into Back Bay and ended up on Newbury Street. We were intrigued as we were walking by a little store we passed called Trident Bookstore and Cafe. We decided to take a quick peek inside and ended up browsing for about an hour. The quaint bookstore was packed to the brim with all kinds of books, knickknacks, and Boston gifts. It was all I could have ever dreamed of for a bookstore, and I had absolutely no idea that it was that close to where I was. That night, after such a wonderful day, I laid in bed, and instead of looking at my photo wall, I closed my eyes and thought of all of Boston that I took in that day with my friend. The emptiness I had felt for so many of those previous nights wasn't gone, but it was smaller, more manageable. It seemed that the more I immersed myself in the city and opened up myself to new opportunities, the more comfortable I felt being here. I began to feel a sense of place in the physical city of Boston. I didn't feel like a stranger to Boston anymore, but rather a newcomer excited to establish roots here, even if it would be only for my college years. And as my comfort in the city grew, I found opportunities to meet new people without trying to recreate my Maryland relationships. I had heard about the Sanctuary Campus Ministry from my dad and was interested in going, but also very nervous. I was afraid that people I met when I went to Sanctuary would end up fading away, just like people I met at the beginning of the year. But as I walked to First Church Boston on the night of my first Sanctuary worship, I convinced myself to just let go of all expectations and let the night go how it would. And that turned out to be one of the best decisions I have made since moving to Boston. I felt an immediate connection with the group of students I met at this get-together and all the other students at get-togethers after that. That night, we discussed lots over pizza, like how we were introduced to Unitarian Universalism, all the way to the worst meal we had had at our dining hall since. By the time the service had started, it felt as if we had known each other for so much longer than just an hour and a half. This special connection between us students was solidified at the end of the service, when the amazing Sanctuary Band announced it was going to perform This Is Me from the movie The Greatest Showman. We promptly got up and danced along in the courtyard with the little kids and adults of Sanctuary for the whole song. As the final note was played, I looked at everybody I had met that night, completely out of breath, and I knew that I had found something really, really special here. These connections that I made felt so much more significant, meaningful than those where I had forced myself to meet people. And I think it's no accident that so soon after I made this shift in expectations for myself, I connected with the Sanctuary Boston campus group. It took a little courage, maybe a lot of courage, to show up at a place like this. And it definitely wasn't the kind of thing I would have done if I was in Maryland. With these people, I didn't feel like I needed to replicate my relationships from Maryland. They were my Boston people. And as my weeks in Boston turned into months, I began to realize that something in me had changed. I no longer felt the emptiness or longing that I had been struggling with for what felt like such a long time. I had found my people, my places, my home in Boston. Opening up to something that was so new at such a vulnerable time for me was incredibly, incredibly difficult. But what came out of it was so worth it. I feel so at home in Boston now that I miss my home here more and more each time I go back to Maryland on a break. So these days, my answer to the question of where home is would sound something like, home is where the Esplanade is. Home is where Sanctuary Boston is. Home is where Trident Bookstore and Cafe is. Home is where the Red Line train is. Home is where my Boston friends are. Home is where I make it. To my Sanctuary home, may you have the courage and the love to find a home within yourself, to find a home around yourself, and to find a home that is just right for you. Home is where you make it.